Hello, we're back, and I want to talk a little bit about fair housing. Fair housing is a huge component of our practice of real estate that we have to be aware of and make sure that we are correctly and legally practicing real estate. And it's kind of nuanced from the fact that we have not only state law that deals with that, but we have a federal law, of course, in Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 that deals specifically with fair housing and the protected classes under that law, under federal law. And then we also have to be concerned with and abide by the Illinois Human Rights Act, which is also it has not only the 7 protected classes under federal law, but has additional protected classes, and all of those are laid out for you within the materials on fair housing that I think you need to make sure that you read and understand. So, and then on top of that, pursuant to Illinois law, local municipalities also have the additional authority to establish different protected classes within their jurisdictions as it pertains to housing. So there's a lot to deal with here, and we have to make sure that we understand all different aspects concerning federal, state, and local fair housing regulation. So with that, I would now like for you to watch a video that was actually produced by the Illinois Realtors, and it was put together in 2018. It is a very good video that discusses a lot of the history of fair housing and how it pertains to the practice of real estate throughout our history. And it actually began, this video was put together as a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the federal fair housing law that was passed originally in 1968. So please watch the video from the Illinois Realtors, and it is called Fair Housing Makes Us Stronger.
Members of the Congress, members of the Cabinet, distinguished Americans, and guests. Few in the nation believed that fair housing would in our time become the unchallenged law of this land. And now, at long last, this afternoon, its day has come. It proclaims that fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
I said to Joanne, I want to go into real estate, because if those guys can do that business, the ones that we've been talking with, hell, I should be a slam dunk for me.
He looked at the contract and he looked at the address of the property and he says, "You're moving to Berwyn?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Why?" And I said, "That's where I want to live." He goes, "There's no Mexicans in Berwyn." And I said, I don't care.
So I had to learn how to speak English like the way I hear it from others. So I had to practice in front of the mirror and, make sure that I kind of be fluid in what I'm saying.
Title 8, the Fair Housing part of the Civil Rights Act, was not much more than tissue paper. Started to get listings, make deals, and the community organizations attacked us that first year. Breaking our office windows, demonstrating in front of the office, coming into office, call and jam our telephones all day long. Stop selling in our neighborhood, click up. Stop blockbusting in our neighborhood, click up. Many times we were sitting before lawyers and appearing for hearings and you stop working when you're preparing. That was not our intention. I wasn't coming out in the marketplace to say I'm going to change the real estate industry, but I aspired, and I've always aspired, to play at its highest level. Right away in '71, I started going to IAR meetings, and I'd be the only one look like me.
The role of the real estate industry wasn't always on the right side of that. There was a concept of private property rights that was going on at that time, which was, it's my property. You can't tell me who I can rent to or who can buy it. Changing that perception of what property rights were, I think, is part of the struggle that we went through as an industry.
There was no other organization picking up that fight for people of color. Black membership wasn't welcome nor allowed in other associations of housing. It definitely bred a need to birth an organization that would fight for people of color.
The Fair Housing Act in 1968 had no teeth. There was no HUD enforcement mechanism. There was a lot of education, a lot of outreach to realtor boards and therefore to members to get people to sign this agreement, explaining why the voluntary agreement was better than these individual agreements out there, and it was a way to promote fair housing. And then leading up to 1988 was an effort to expand the Fair Housing Act in two ways: to give enforcement authority to HUD and to add familial status and people with disabilities to the protected groups. So fair housing training became a part of becoming a realtor, and in many places a part of staying a realtor.
We all want the same thing. We want a nice place for our children to grow up. And it's not just the house, it's a community, that there are good schools, there's safety, there's police protection, folks take care of their property as best they can. We all want the same thing.
Fair housing doesn't mean equal. Doesn't mean that the $1 million homes are going to be, be reciprocated on in the underserved communities. That's, to me, I believe that what we're looking for is a community that can be holistic in and of itself, where it can be sustaining, meaning that the people who live there can work in that community and have a normal life, a normal healthy life, and project for their children in the future.
You have white flight that still takes place. You have appraisal issues that are incredible, that erode away, that wealth that families, get into home ownership. One of the things families get into home ownership for. Would there be improvements? Definitely. But are there still tremendous strides and advocacy warranted to address? Definitely.
Daughter-in-law is Asian American. And whenever they show houses to her only, they show less houses than when she's with the husband. I think that's subtle, but not subtle, because you can tell that there is discrimination and that you're being given limited houses to see. We're all fighting for non-discrimination. Martin Luther King has gone, and we're still thinking about him, or we're still doing the same things.
She looked at me and she told me, I'm only going to sell this house to a minority. Don't bring me any white buyers. And she was white. She said, don't bring me any white buyers. I'm only going to sell this to a Hispanic or a black person. And I looked at her and I said, we can't discriminate.
Diversity is not every race doing business in black neighborhoods. That's not diversity, right? And I've attended diversity trainings where I've had to scratch my head, because that tends to have been what gets perpetuated. Diversity would be black and white and all races and colors and creeds being able to do business, transact business for our members across the state, right? That would be blacks and white neighborhoods and so on. Like, it would be a collage of everybody seeing an opportunity to do business.
One of the many hats that I wear professionally is I am also a real estate pre-license instructor. And as I've said, to me personally, the fair housing chapter in the pre-license textbook was really nothing more than a chapter of stuff that had to be memorized and something out of ancient history because I'd not seen it myself with my own eyes. And the last time I taught that chapter, which was just last week, Frank Williams' story was in that. So learning more about the history of this, learning more about the work that still needs to be done has been really important to me because it has directly impacted the way that I'm teaching what will be the next generation of real estate professionals so that they understand that which I did not understand for the first 18, 19 years of my time in this profession.
I am encouraged. I'm encouraged that that we're having these conversations today. From the perspective of 50 years ago, they were very uncomfortable, and even today they're uncomfortable. Be a little uncomfortable. If we're gonna grow, you have to learn how to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And if we can do that, I think that we can all move to a different level.
Okay, we're back and we're still talking about fair housing, and we've got a lot more to discuss with that. But the first thing, what we have done is we've put together some case studies and some scenarios for you to go through and answer questions that were asked based on these scenarios that deal specifically with fair housing. Those are located within your materials, and you can proceed to the fair housing case studies. There are 3 of those case studies. One deals with accommodations and modifications. One deals with disparate impact that we're going to have further discussion on with Chris and I and in a video, and then also on steering.
Please pause the video. You'll return to your coursework to read and think through case studies A through C in the fair housing reading. Remember, this coincides with the full course PDF. When you're done with the fair housing case studies, please return to the fair housing video guide.
All right, we're back, and I wanted to have a little further discussion after you've taken the case study exercise that we put together for you on fair housing. The other thing that is kind of a topic that has come up quite a bit, especially as it deals with property management and landlord issues over the last 3 or 4 years, because there have been some litigation involved with this, and that's about the disparate treatment and disparate effect or disparate impact that some of the policies that landlords and or property managers may use on screening tenants. So I've provided quite a bit of material in your student materials concerning this, and I think it's an important thing, especially if you're going to practice property management, that you need to understand. So at this point, what I would like for you to do is we have, Chris Reed and I have put together a short video that talks specifically about disparate treatment, disparate impact, and to ensure that we are properly providing services to everyone without violating fair housing law. So please go watch the video that Chris and I have put together, and we'll be back shortly. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion that's in our appendix of our materials on the COR course. And Chris and I are going to have a little bit of discussion, specifically if you're a property manager. There's been some confusion about disparate treatment and disparate effect or disparate impact, and exactly what you can and cannot ask people specifically as it pertains to criminal background. And there's some history on all of this now, going all the way back to like 2013. HUD had issued some rules that really have basically the same effect as law. And there was a lawsuit filed in Texas against that. And basically, it was a matter of who has the burden of proof, I guess, more so. And so that actually went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, as they many times do, kind of left us, they ruled on one part, but maybe not entirely to really clarify the whole thing. So after that was in 2015 when that Supreme Court case came down, and after that, then HUD issued guidelines that don't have the same effect of law, but there were some guidelines. You want to talk a little bit about what some of those guidelines are?
Let me just backtrack one just a little bit here, Norm. Disparate impact, the whole concept of disparate impact means that it is a housing policy that has been put out there, is not intended to discriminate.
Correct.
But in reality, it winds up in discrimination, and that was what
against
was
some
tested.
of the protected classes,
Correct.
Particular ones, because the impact of, like you said, it didn't have a specific problem with the way they were administering a certain portion of their policy, but because it may have impacted certain protected classes more so than others. And the one that always seems to rear its ugly head is the criminal background part of it.
Right.
So that's the basis of it, yeah.
And in regard to the criminal background, HUD came out with guidelines, not rules, not laws, but guidelines that said if in fact you're going to deny housing based on a criminal background check, that the landlord needs to be very careful, and obviously the licensee that's working with the landlord needs to be educating the landlord on how they're handling turning away someone because of a criminal background check. So some of the guidelines that they came up with was first of all, you should use convictions, not arrests.
Correct.
And by the way, this whole thing on criminal background, there was a study that was done that showed that African Americans, Hispanics, have a higher incarceration rate than other races. So that's where that whole concept of disparate impact comes into play. All right, so going back to the guidelines, that number one, looking at convictions, not arrests, looking at individual analysis, not a blanket statement. HUD says use vanilla language. For those of you who are not cooks, vanilla is plain. So a housing policy should not say we will not accept any applications of anybody that has had a conviction.
A felony conviction,
A felony,
let's
correct,
say.
correct.
You have to have a analyzation of what that actually was to see if it would have an effect on other tenants and their property
Right.
and that kind of thing, right?
Time frame. Did this conviction happen 3 years ago, which is what HUD says is the most ideal, looking back in the last 3 years? If it was something that happened 25 years ago and the individual has had a clean slate since then, that should not be a reason to deny housing.
And I think it's going to be interesting also to see because, here, especially right here in Illinois, we just recently passed this marijuana legislation where they actually have expunged a lot of those convictions that happened previous. And that's really, I think, going to have that could play into this as well,
And it's interesting that HUD came out in their guidelines that said that there was only one incident that had an absolute, yes, you can deny housing, and that was the producing and distribution of a controlled substance.
Correct.
So not just using the marijuana, but if you're
Or
actually,
even selling it,
right.
it had to be production.
right.
And I think we deal with that a lot too anyway with, because what was it, about 8 years ago when they added, or 10 years ago, when they added in our disclosure law about, the production of methamphetamines in properties and things like that. So I think that does make a big difference, because I think a lot of property managers had a blanket policy that, if you've got a conviction, a felony conviction, or even we're looking at arrest records, that this is going to have an effect on it. And the interesting part is there are a number, even after this Supreme Court decision in 2015, like I said, it wasn't real clear and didn't clarify everything out to the point. Then subsequently HUD developed these guidelines, which doesn't have the same effect of law. And now there's 4, 5, 6, 10 different lawsuits out there that are working its way through the courts. So hopefully at some point they'll come up with some clarifying case law for this. But I think it's the biggest thing that I think, and you hit on, was you have to have a policy. You have to look at every individual case and make sure that you analyze that case and have policies that don't basically have this disparate impact.
And when you're saying having policy, you're saying the landlords are the ones that
That's
are
what I
making the
meant, yeah.
decision, but the licensee are the ones that are educating the landlords.
Correct.
A lot of these, here's an interesting thing, a lot of these communities that have these the education classes that they mandate, they don't even talk about these things in those classes.
Right.
I mean, you talk about a housing policy that's not intended to do discrimination, and yet here they're bringing landlords in to do education, but they don't talk about the changes in the law. And that's where the licensee can help their landlord so that they're not getting in trouble.
Right, especially when you're, and I mean, as well, we started teaching about this, a couple of years ago after all of this came down 3 years ago. I mean, about the disparate impact. We may have been teaching about it, but it was not like anybody really noticed. And then...
Do you know, I made a joke of it and said, well, if you took it to the extreme, people could say we're discriminating against criminals. And look what happened. I mean, I was teaching that.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what that court case interpretation went to.
It has, and I think what you have to also look is that HUD addressed this back in 2013 to start with, and then the court case kind of leveled it out somewhat, but wasn't real clear all the way across the board. And as we watch all this work through the courts, I think you're going to see more of it. But you're right, and we still have a lot of people out here running around. I can rent to whoever I want to and when I want to, and this is, and the interesting part, what I was going to say, when I started, bringing this up in courses in CE and things like that, then, people get this wide eye. What are you talking about? And I said, well, you have to have a policy that meets these standards and guidelines. And I said, hopefully it's going to clear itself up, because right now we're kind of in a limbo of what I would call it, but I think you don't want to be the test case.
Right.
So.
Can I switch topics here?
Sure.
Because there's another change that happened in 2016 when the added to national origin protected class is the limited English proficiency, LEP. And you have some materials in your appendix also on that. Again, if someone is denying housing because they can't speak to them, they can't communicate to them, they can't speak really good English, what do we need to do as licensees? And there are some guidelines for you in that appendix. I really strongly suggest that you take a look at that. From you as a licensee, like for example, giving someone enough time to take their document or their application or their lease or their contract to someone that can interpret for them, that can there's a reason why you don't want to get involved in interpreting, even if you're speaking, because there's a lot of legalese that are lost in the interpretations. So it's just something that we have to really keep aware of.
That's a
in the
great
changes.
point. And, you know, one of the things that I've always said, you know, when we list and sell properties, that's one thing, but you are opening up a lot of different types of regulation and problems and issues when you lease or you're a property manager and you're a licensee. And, you know, how many times have we had licensees, well, you know, I kind of just do this property management thing on the side and things like that, and it's not anything to be sneezed at. I think you have to understand that they are usually smaller transactions, although there's more of them, but your liability is huge.
It's bigger. Right?
Yeah, it
Small
really
transaction, bigger liability.
Yeah, it really is. And, you know, we all know that property management can be, especially in residential, can be very lucrative, but it also has its own different laws that you have to abide by. And this is just one example of it. You're with the language situation is another one. So,
Important thing to remember is that if there's any discrimination and a licensee is involved, whether the landlord is discriminating, whether the licensee is going to be involved, and they're going to have to defend themselves. And if the situation is found to be a fair housing violation, their license is going to be disciplined. Their license will be taken away for a minimum amount of time in addition to
the license law is
penalties.
very brief on it. It just basically said if a licensee is found in violation of any fair housing law, whether it be federal, state, or local, their license will either be suspended or revoked.
Right.
So the other thing that I did want to talk about in the appendix where we talked about reasonable accommodation, there's some really great examples in those materials. If you're into property management with the physical or mental handicapped or situations, and I think there's some great examples back there, and we took these right off the HUD, and there's some really good information in there. So
Pets too, animals.
I think there's some in there, yeah.
Information
yeah,
in there, right?
about specifically for companion animals and service animals. So, but anyway, well, thank you, Chris. It's been nice talking to you today.
Please pause the video, return to your coursework, to the Fair Housing module, and take the Fair Housing quiz. When you're done and have submitted your quiz, please return to the Fair Housing video guide.
Okay, let's go over our fair housing and its case studies, its simulations with scenarios built into it, and we'll go through it, and hopefully you'll have a better understanding. So let's start with case study A, scenario 1. All right. A prospective tenant, Judy, is interested in leasing a unit in an apartment complex, and she has a physical disability which is not visible when you first meet Judy. The property management company, Safe Rentals, manages the property and is a licensed sponsoring broker in Illinois. What should Safe Rentals request from Judy concerning her disability? And the correct answer for what could Safe Rentals request from Judy? And the correct answer is a medical verification of Judy's disability. Okay? So you always want to ask for verification. You don't have to get details about her disability, but a verification from a doctor and that she does have a disability. Okay, scenario number 2. Judy enters into a lease agreement with Safe Rental. Judy requests to reserve a parking spot closest to the entrance to her unit. Safe Rentals has an open policy on parking and does not reserve parking spots for any of its tenants. So the question is, can Safe Rentals deny this request? And the correct answer would be no, because it is a reasonable accommodation based on her disability. Okay? Scenario number 3, Judy has problems entering her unit and needs a wider door entry into her unit, but she makes no mention of this to Safe Rentals. So the question is, does Safe Rentals have an obligation to install a wider door entry? And the answer is no, because Judy has to request that accommodation. In other words, if there is an accommodation requested or needed, then the tenant has an obligation to request that accommodation. Okay? And our final scenario in case study A, Safe Rentals provides a dumpster that is located across a graveled area that Judy cannot negotiate her wheelchair over. So now Judy's in a wheelchair, even though it wasn't obvious maybe at the beginning. So Judy requests the maintenance man pick up her trash every day and take it to the dumpster. Safe Rentals maintenance man only works 2 days a week at that complex. What is Safe Rentals' best course or recourse in this situation? Well, the best answer out of all of this is negotiate an alternative reasonable accommodation. Okay? And so, in other words, they don't have to send a maintenance man over there every day if they can work out a reasonable accommodation for Judy. All right. Let's go into case study B, scenario 1. Dave is applying for an apartment managed by Best Management. He is a recovering alcoholic, sober for 9 years. He has lived in a group home for men receiving treatment for alcoholism and drug addiction for the past 8 years, and now wants to live on his own. He had a number of arrests for alcohol-related crimes, the last one being 9 years ago. He's also been arrested twice in the last 3 years for speeding and for writing a bad check, but no convictions. 2 felony convictions, 1 for assault and battery, and another for criminal trespass 10 years ago related to his alcohol abuse. So, question number 1, what would be appropriate for Best Management to ask Dave on his accommodations or his application? And the correct answer is his felony convictions within the past 3 years, because that would be based on the HUD guidelines, okay? You want to look at convictions, not arrest records, okay? And in fact, there have been some municipalities pass some laws based on this, and there is talk that Illinois passed a law based on that it has to be based on convictions, not arrests. And of course, once that law is written, I'm sure there's going to be some rules, and then there will be some court cases to give us some more guidance, okay? But the best guidance you can have right now is the felony convictions within the past 3 years. Dave disclosed his felony convictions from 9 years ago, but not the details of the conviction. What would be appropriate for Best Management to do following this disclosure? So in other words, they only went back 3 years, they only asked for 3 years, but Dave said, hey, I was convicted of these nefarious crimes 9 years ago, and explained the situation. So what would be appropriate for Best Management to do following this disclosure? Request additional information from Dave. And the reason I'm saying that is because it could be reasonable based on policy that you have a policy that if it somehow endangers the other tenants' well-being or their property, you could deny housing, but you have to have policy on it. Dave provided information to Best Management that he had been sober for 9 years and had no further felony arrests or convictions since. He also disclosed that he had been living in the group home but was now ready to live on his own. Best management's policy is to deny all applications with felony convictions. Is that a valid policy? And no, because they should evaluate each application on its merits based on their reasonable policies. Okay? Let's go to C. Case study C, scenario 1. Maria listed Jorge's home in Champaign. Jorge only wants to sell to someone who is Latino. What should Maria do? And the correct answer would be explain to Jorge that if this is his position, she would have to cancel the listing. So the point being here is that you cannot participate in what you would know to be discrimination. Maria is contacted by Camilla, who is moving to Champaign. Camilla would like to live around other Latinos and asks Maria for information on Latino neighborhoods. What information could Maria provide to Camilla? And the correct answer, the best answer, is links to demographic information in Champaign. And that will have a breakdown of nationalities and race and a lot of different things, and it's based on Census Bureau or other information that is public. And it would not be that you were guiding them into certain areas or steering. Jorge receives 2 offers on his property. Jorge can evaluate the offers based on what information except the nationality of the offerers. And that is the correct answer. Okay, that completes our fair housing quiz explanation. Thank you.
Please pause the video. Now is a great time to check your grades. You'll find grades near the top of the link where you've also been accessing content. Once you have checked your grades, return to Content to your coursework, go to the appendix, and begin the appendix and closing steps video guide. Norm has a few more things to show you, and I will show you how to close out this course so that it is sent to us and we then send it to IDFPR.